Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this afternoon webinar on online civil liberties and developments around the freedom of speech on the internet and on big platforms. My name is Fredrik Eriksson and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Jacob Mashangama, and I look forward to the conversation we are going to have in the next hour. Jacob and I are going to talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to open up for questions and comments from people in the audience. I suppose you're all Zoom experts by now, so you know you can join this conversation in two ways. You can raise your hand, and then you will be allowed to ask the question or make the comment yourself. Or you can put your contribution in the chat function, and then I will bring your comment or question to Jacob. And please feel free to join in whenever you want during the conversation, because then it is possible that I can weave your question or comment into what I will be asking Jacob about. So I'm very pleased to welcome today Jacob Mashangama to talk about how we protect freedom of speech in our online age. Jacob is a prolific author on all matters related to the freedom of speech, and he has actually a new book coming out soon called Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media, a book that we very much looking forward to read. I think it's due out in the beginning of next year. Jacob is a Danish lawyer and founding director of Justitia, a judicial think tank promoting the rule of law, fundamental human rights, and freedom rights. He's also the executive director of the Future of Free Speech project and author of several studies on free speech, including Rushing to Judgment, are short mandatory takedown limits for online hate speech compatible with the freedom of expression, ? Jacob, I should say, is also the host of the podcast series, Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech. Jacob, very much welcome to our conversation today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me. I really look forward to this.
So do I. And let's start the conversation in the United States and the chaotic situation on January the 6th this year, when supporters of Donald Trump gathered in Washington, D.C. to protest against the election result, or what they thought was a stolen election. It all ended in chaos with the storming of the US Capitol, and soon after that, big platforms like Facebook and Twitter canceled the accounts of many users and banned even the United States president from the platform, arguing that Donald Trump and others had used their accounts to stoke the rebellion and spread lies and misinformation. Many political leaders in Europe, including Angela Merkel, reacted critically to these moves by the platform, saying that the denial of access to these platforms is at least problematic from the viewpoint of the freedom of speech. And some even said that this is dangerous for the freedom of speech. So, Jacob, would you agree with that criticism? And would you even say that the moderation rules of big platforms have become a threat to online civil liberties?
That's a huge question, but yes, I think at the very least they pose challenges. I would say on the one hand, I think no one can dispute that in 2021 the vast majority of people around the world have unprecedented access to share and access information that you and I could only dream about, 15 years ago. And if you were living in the 90s, for instance, even though you would have strong free speech protections legally, in practice, it would be a small elite of journalists, editors, politicians, intellectuals who would get to shape public debate and really filter what kind of information that we have. And then there was this positive with the advance of the World Wide Web. There was this idea that now free speech would be an unstoppable force for good, for freedom of expression. That was given a lot of impetus with the Arab Spring and the role that social media played in allowing savvy tech bloggers and others to document abuses, to rally people in Tahrir Square and so on. And we loved that in the West, in democracies, when this was happening in authoritarian states. But But then at the same time, the World Wide Web was undergoing a change. So from a more sort of decentralized horizontal web, we moved towards what I call platformization. So you had the emergence of these huge platforms like Facebook, for instance, where you suddenly have billions of people, and where Facebook is this is where you access centrally and share information, and it's basically Facebook's rules and its content moderation rules, practices that determined where the limits for free speech are being drawn, and that will inevitably create a lot of tension, because globally we disagree fundamentally about where should the limits on free speech be. And even democracies, as we see, when their authority and their values are suddenly being challenged online, when it's not tyrants in the Middle East, when it's democratically elected government, when it's Macron and Merkel, they actually no longer think free speech on social media platforms is such a great idea anymore. Then they change their tune, and maybe we can come back to how this is history repeating itself, and we see what I call elite panic every time the democratic sphere is being enlarged, and people who previously didn't have a voice and people with controversial voices are suddenly being thrust into the public sphere. So, and obviously the question of Trump is an extremely divisive character, and no one can deny that he used his platforms to spread lies and disinformation that had a profound effect. I think, if Donald Trump and his supporters had not waged a systematic campaign of disinformation following the election defeat, then it's unlikely that the attack on the Capitol would have happened. So if you ask me specifically about that incident, I thought that that blocking Trump during and immediately after the attack, which was, after all, an attack on the heart of American democracy, I thought that was called for. But on the other hand, I tend to agree with Facebook's with the oversight board that Facebook has set up, that it was problematic to indefinitely suspend Trump because however controversial Trump is, there are actually a lot of people out there who are more extreme, and so this was sort of an arbitrary decision, not based on any clear criterion, but more or less, I think, because Trump was now out of power, and then Silicon Valley thought, well, now we can actually get rid of this guy who's really done more than anyone, perhaps, to make us unpopular. That was a very long answer. I hope it made sense.
No, not at all. No, not at all. But to follow on from that, what you just said, Jacob. So if we look sort of at not necessarily the specific case, because there's always going to be sort of nuances that are important to take care of and to look at when you are, as for instance, in sort of the heat of January the 6th, you need to have some action coming from the big platforms in order to avoid that their platforms actually become part of sort of stoking something which could end up as being sort of an attack, as I say, on the heart of American democracy. But if we look more at sort of policies that some of these platforms have taken, it could be Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and if we look at it from the viewpoint of sort of the tradition, the culture of free speech, can you make a sort of a case here that some type of rules are more problematic than others, that they may lead to sort of more intervention, more censorship of rules than others do? Have we learned anything from the development over the past years? What type of rules that lead to sort of the least intervention or the least consequences for the freedom of speech? Or even, are there some type of rules that are more problematic than other rules are?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'm delighted you used the term a culture of free speech, because I think that is the key to the current disconnect and controversies over online free speech in the digital sphere. You know, in the analog age, free speech was very much about the state and the citizen. Today, in our digital age, it's very much a relationship first and foremost between users and platforms, but governments are more and more demanding a say. So the relationship becomes much more complicated because some of the actions that Facebook and Twitter take, no one would doubt that would be a violation of free speech if those were governments. But on the other hand, I think a lot of us also recognize that, you know, there might be good reasons why LinkedIn would not want the same terms of service as Facebook, for instance, because LinkedIn is mainly a platform for professionals to network and brag. But whereas Facebook has a much broader remit, it's about politics, it's about cat videos and so on. So some have sort of tried to solve this by just saying, you know, oh, since what goes on private platforms is not formally to do with free speech, you know, it's not constitutional freedom of expression, it's not human rights, then this is not really a free speech issue, and therefore we shouldn't care whether Facebook removes, discriminate on the basis of political opinion, for instance. I don't share that argument fully. I think, you know, if you go back to some of the leading thinkers about free speech, including Judge Stuart Mill, George Orwell, and others, they would say that free speech is about more than the government limiting your right to free speech. It is actually about a culture of free speech. It's also about how tolerant a society and its dominant institutions are towards ideas that are seen as running against whatever orthodox prevails at a particular moment. And if those informal norms are being those who go against the grain of that orthodoxy, if they are being shunned, then free speech will also suffer. On the other hand, I also don't think it would make sense if Facebook and Twitter should treat speech on their platforms in the same way as governments. I think that would not make sense. And also, we tend to speak only about sort of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We forget that, you know, there are lots of other, many of them smaller sites and platforms out there that also that differentiate themselves from the larger platforms, and therefore one set of rules is not likely to reflect the diversity of platforms out there. But this also makes it extremely difficult to come up with a solution. I would say, sort of from looking at history, I would say my takeaway is that whenever you have centralized command and control over information and opinion, that tends to hurt free speech. When you have more decentralized ecosystem of opinion and information, that has traditionally been a lot better for free speech and diverse opinions. And so I don't like having huge centralized platforms where governments can use their power both directly and indirectly to sort of have them act as choke points. Because initially, if you looked, Facebook and Twitter come out of Silicon Valley, and if you go back 10 years, their ethos was very much this civil libertarian, techno utopian attitude where free speech was an unmitigated good, and they would allow anything more or less, or they would model sort of their principles on the First Amendment in the US, which is more speech protective than in European democracies. But once you grow and once you get a lot of stakeholders and once you engage with governments and once you get a lot of on a global platform where a lot of people don't share that commitment to protecting even extreme speech, these platforms, who are, after all, at the end of the day, in it for the money, are not going to die on the hill of extreme speech. You know, are they going to say, okay, we'll lose all revenue and be kicked out of Germany if we don't defend, if we don't give up the speech right of neo-Nazis? I think, you know, they're not going to go with the Nazis, just to make sort of an extreme example. But the problem with this is that, you know, then it becomes sort of, to use a cliche, a slippery slope. And what I see is a development where the movement is always towards more and more removals. You know, the terms of service and community standards are being expanded as the scope creeps, so more and more categories are being banned. And you see that if you go to the enforcement reports of Facebook, you'll see a quite explosive development in the number or in the number of pieces of content that are being removed. So I think if you go back to the last quarter of 2017, it was something like 1.6 million pieces of content removed for hate speech. If you go to the last quarter of 2020, it's 27 million. So that's a dramatic increase. And you and I have no idea of knowing what is included in this, because unlike when governments, at least democratic governments, remove or restrict free speech, you know, you have a process with transparency. It's ultimately a court that decides if someone can be convicted of saying something that violates criminal law. That is not the case on these platforms. In fact, almost 99% or 98% of the content removed as hate speech has been proactively identified by automated content moderation, so machine learning, rather than human beings. And you know, machine learning and AI can be great tools for many things, but they're not specifically sophisticated when it comes to context, which is extremely important for determining whether something violates red lines. And then you have a lot of categories that are, you know, hate speech is one of the favorite categories for governments to crack down on. But, you know, definitions of hate speech vary very greatly. And lots of different groups tend to want to be protected by hate speech bans. And so you basically see the scope of hate speech being expanded, and thus you risk a lot of comments on current affairs, politics, and so on being targeted by that without us knowing, except when some example hits the media, you know, who gets hit the worst, and whether there are biases. You know, basically, if you ask any group, you know, if you go to the US, conservatives will say, oh, Silicon Valley has a strong anti-conservative bias. If you go to progressives, they will say, oh, Facebook and Twitter hurt minorities, and so on. So everyone can sort of cherry pick their example of how these platforms are sort of biased against them. And this creates endless controversies, and where you have the platform sort of more or less just making up rules as they go, because they you know, so if there's one controversy, they all say, okay, we'll make sure to crack down on that type of speech in the future. And that creates sort of a quilt of incoherent rules that tend to hurt free speech.
Indeed. Picking up of also what you said, Jacob, on perhaps that I mean, my question is probably this: are we focusing too much on the big platforms here? I mean, to take a couple of examples, with the development we have now with platforms like MeWe, Gab, Parler, etc. I saw a study coming out just a few days ago suggesting that anti-Semitism on Clubhouse has been rampant in many countries, and that there's no way for them to basically control what type of, in this case, hate speech that goes on a platform like Clubhouse. I saw a study for Germany, which looked at anti-Semitic postings and the number of viewings of anti-Semitic messages on another platform, not one of the big social media platforms there. And to me, I mean, this looks to be sort of a really fast growth that is taking place with hate speech. Now, if we move to something else that isn't necessarily hate speech, but taking sort of more of a January the 6th type of example, when you have a very heated situation and you are at the risk of a social media platform can become complicit in spreading a lot of passion or a lot of sort of intent of trying to destroy democratic institutions. Now, I don't know this myself, I haven't seen in a study, but I've seen several suggestions arguing that TikTok and its role in Israel and Palestine today is pretty problematic, to use that word, in the sense that it has very little control of what type of content that is being put on the platform, leading to sort of a lot of content that is manipulated, and it stokes a lot of the frictions that we've seen. I mean, some of this, and I think this has been proven, was in the beginning now of the serious round of conflicts, where a lot of sort of manipulated content was sort of making up stories of what actually was going on, and you had sort of people reacting to that. So coming back to my question, I mean, are we focusing too much on the big platforms, you know, the likes of Facebook and Twitter, when perhaps the most difficult development have now migrated to other platforms and it happens elsewhere?
I think there's definitely a tendency to focus too much on the bigger platforms, and that can hurt, you know, and you know, there's also a certain degree of cynicism. So if you look at Facebook, they have sort of in the past couple of years changed their strategy from sort of trying to. A couple of years ago, Mark Zuckerberg tried to defend having Holocaust denial, for instance, on his platform, and gave this speech at Georgetown University where he tried to sort of really go to bat for free speech, and didn't play well. A lot of people criticized him, and then he changed his tune. And now Facebook are basically more or less begging to be regulated. And why are they doing that? Well, you know, if you want to be cynical about it, but also perhaps realistic, it's because Facebook has the means and resources to actually implement content moderation at a scale much more efficiently than many others. They may not be able to hit, you know, 100% in each jurisdiction of what, you know, leading opinion and governments want. But they can do a pretty good job, and they will know that, you know, if you have a better product that could compete with Facebook, then it might be very difficult if you have to spend sort of 30% of your R&D budget on developing the necessary algorithms and hire, you know, thousands and thousands of content moderators. When you don't have the resources to do something like that, so that's a bit cynical, and that's the danger of sort of focusing too much on specific platforms, who then also get to be the ones who, through their relationship with regulators and decision makers, get to have a huge say in the design that sort of fits them specifically, and may actually have unintended consequences or not so unintended consequences for others. But I think when we talk about TikTok and others, I also think, I think governments in democratic states, especially, they have to basically accept that in a digital world, if you want to be a democracy and base yourself on a fundamental value of free speech, you will not be able to control the public sphere completely. So if you purge a lot of people, Trump supporters, from Facebook and Twitter, that might result in a drop on these platforms. But a lot of those who are purged will then migrate to, maybe they'll migrate to messaging apps. They'll migrate to Telegram, for instance. We saw a huge spike in Telegram after Trump supporters were purged from Parler and other things. And then is it better to have extremists on major platforms where we can engage with them, where they're more or less out in the open, or is it better to have them hidden away on smaller platforms where they can still spread their ideas, but unopposed, with less publicity, and maybe also away from the eyes of law enforcement and so on. So I don't, this is something that goes back to sort of the middle of the 19th century, where most European states finally gave up pre-publication censorship. This was not necessarily because they were against this on principle. It was just a realization that their populations had reached a certain level of literacy. Print technology had become so sophisticated, and also books could be spread across borders. So it was basically it didn't make sense anymore to try to stop print newspapers, books at the source, but instead they ramped up their post-publication censorship operations. And I think governments in our age will have to accept this loss of control and saying the idea that we can eradicate hate speech, or that we can eradicate disinformation, does not make sense. That is simply not possible anymore. And also, it's not a new phenomenon, by the way. It was always there, but now, the harm, hates, and hoaxes have been amplified, certainly. Even though, you mentioned studies that showed a spike in certain types of hate speech, and that will, the Israel-Palestine conflict will almost inevitably result in a spike of anti-Semitism and maybe also anti-Muslim sentiments. But there are a number of studies that actually suggest that hate speech, the absolute number is obviously huge. On hate speech, you can find hundreds and thousands, but the proportion of the total content is minuscule when it comes to this. And this is also true of disinformation. So a lot of studies have really questioned this idea that was around 2017, 2018, that basically fake news had decided the American election. It was only because of fake news that Americans had been duped into voting for Donald Trump. That I think rests on pretty slim evidence. But we have a tendency as human beings to focus on the negative aspects and take for granted all the positive aspects. And I think we forget how important free speech is for us. How completely how unprecedented it is that you and I can sit in different parts of the world and communicate with other those who might be viewing from anywhere in the world without any controls. This is something that has never been possible for generations before us, and it has led to a lot of goods but we just take them for granted, and we don't see the positive aspects of free speech, but we focus very much on the negative ones, and we maybe do not balance these things properly against each other. And then, you know, if we say that the negative aspects, if we focus all our efforts on them, then we risk undermining all the positive aspects of free speech, and that's very much my fear.
I think that is a very good point, Jacob. Another very good point you just made, which I think should receive a lot more attention, sort of, is that the evidence out there isn't really suggesting that we are becoming more tribal because of social media. We have been tribal for a very, very long time. And sort of, if I go back and look at sort of my own personal history, what life was like sort of in the 1970s or 1980s, it wasn't as, you know, if we were all open, tolerant people who readily accepted the viewpoints of other people, and sort of a lot of studies that are out there right now looking at issues like, you know, tribal tendencies of social media, filter bubbles, etc., tend to basically point out that there is not very much evidence out there suggesting that this is the case. Now, let's move on to talk a little bit more about government actions and what governments are doing. Because, I mean, big platforms aren't just acting on the basis of their own volition. Governments are also imposing more behavioral norms and restrictions on what platforms should or perhaps shouldn't do. So if we start in Europe, we have policies on online hate speech and illegal content, with rules mandating what platforms should do when they get flagged about illegal content. We also have special regulations on terrorism, with mandated takedown actions for platforms there. We have a new proposal on the table in Europe called the Digital Services Act that expands on the current body of laws and regulation, and that puts many new behavioral norms on platforms that easily, I think, can be seen as an attempt to widen the scope of moderation policies to include content that, you know, it may be illegal, or it probably isn't illegal, but it may be objectionable, and it may be problematic from other viewpoints. And I think this perhaps goes to the heart of the issue of civil liberties online, because now we are talking about measures that are being taken by a government. So it's not just sort of a culture of free speech, it's also the legal framework for free speech. So I was hoping we could start a conversation here by talking about what you would say are legitimate actions by government, and perhaps also what are illegitimate actions when it comes to the field of mandatory behavior regulations that comes from governments on the platforms.
So sort of the gold standard of so-called intermediary liability laws is the NetzDG, so the Network Enforcement Act that Germany adopted in 2017 and entered into force to full force in 2018, which says that platforms with I think 2 million users have to remove flagged manifestly unlawful illegal content within 24 hours or risk fines of up to 50 million euros. And we've seen a lot of countries copying that. So we've done 2 studies a year apart. And the first study, I think we've identified 12 or 13 countries around the world that had more or less copy-pasted the German model. And last year we released another one, and I think that showed 23 or 24 countries. And the interesting thing is the countries involve Russia, Belarus, Venezuela, Turkey, Singapore, and so on. So the majority of these countries are not democracies. They are illiberal states, and many of them actually explicitly reference the German precedent. So obviously they do it in bad faith. It's not, and they don't include the same rule of law protections and constitutional protections of free speech that you would have in Germany, where you have, you know, independent courts that will do a balancing act of free speech versus competing interests. But it nonetheless, I think, shows the problematic nature of open democracies sort of creating a prototype in it, because when we're talking about the internet, we're talking about social media, these are global platforms. And therefore, I think there's an obligation on open democracies to be the guardians of free speech rather than those that unwittingly forge the chains with which authoritarian states can bind their own citizens in cyberspace. And I think this shows that the unintended consequences of legislation online are huge. You know, if you look at if you ask the German government, it will show you its assessment of the NetzDG, and it will say, well, there's really no evidence that this has led to overblocking. But that's because the platforms like Facebook and Twitter, most of the takedowns are not done under the NetzDG. As a result, in order to basically say, well, we don't want to risk a 50 million euro fine because we host neo-Nazis, so we don't want to take a chance. We will just expand our definition of hate speech and other categories that might mirror categories that are prohibited under German law, and then we will police them vigorously on our platform. So what we've seen, so I mentioned to you the statistics in the growth of takedowns on hate speech under Facebook's transparency reports, and they mirror quite nicely whether this is I cannot prove a direct causal relationship, but it is quite stunning that this huge growth happened, after the NetzDG and similar laws were adopted. So I think, Europe has played, I think, European democracy, and also, the Commission has on many times sort of threatened to adopt similar rules. They have adopted, of course, this code of conduct on hate speech and this voluntary agreement on hate speech. But these agreements that they made on hate speech and disinformation are, I would say, what Don Corleone called an offer you can't refuse. So it's basically saying, hey, Facebook and Twitter, would you like to enter into a voluntary agreement with the European Commission about removing stuff as fast as possible? No? Well, then, we have legislation that we could impose on you. So I think this is problematic from the point of view, especially of democracies. Also because, if you look at Freedom House's annual reports on internet freedom, you actually see, I think, 10 years, a decade of retrograde developments where online free speech has been in decline. And I think it's very it's very difficult when Macron as France adopt a fake news law that allows courts to order removal of misinformation prior and during elections, then it becomes difficult to tell Modi in India that his ordering of Twitter and Facebook to remove what they label as misinformation showing how they've botched their handling of COVID. What authority, what legitimacy do democracies have when they actually are the trailblazers? So I think I think that democracies really have to be the trailblazers in inculcating this culture of free speech, which means resisting this tendency of elite panic that has always that always accompanies technological developments, coupled with providing a voice to previously voiceless groups that perhaps elites and those who dominate the public sphere preferred were not given a voice in the public sphere. But on the other hand, of course, there are, as I said, if you have a criminal law and people say something, that goes against the criminal law, then obviously government should be able to punish it. So one of the things that I think is particularly important is to be more assertive in cracking down on threats, because there's a tendency online to use threats more casually, because you might think just sending a threat over online is fast. You don't have to think about if I were to send you a threat by snail mail, it would take a long time, and I would probably have calmed down and thought about it twice. I might not do that if we're in a heated argument. But I think threats don't advance an argument. It's not about a viewpoint. It's a direct attempt to stifle speech. So that's something that governments, I think, should legitimately crack down on. But I think there's also some promising research which actually shows that some elements of counterspeech can actually help reduce hate speech. And of course, ever since 2016, there's a whole cottage industry. Nate mentioned a prominent think tank or university which doesn't have some specific program on disinformation and misinformation. Now everyone is dealing about these things, and some of the work is not very good, some of it is brilliant, and that obviously also helps us to develop our system of what one author has called open vigilance, sort of training us as individuals to no longer have this sort of, maybe initially, at the infancy of social media, we treated everything that we saw as great. We were not as skeptical, but of course we have to be skeptical as users on free speech. We have to distinguish between what is written by some random dude on free speech and what is being, gone through a vetting process of professional journalism and so on. But it's a very, psychologically, it's very difficult for human beings and for governments to sit idly by when there are people who mobilize and who seem to be, whose ideas go against the very ideals and fundamentals of democracy, and they might seem to be gaining traction on these platforms. That's very difficult psychologically to ignore.
Yeah,
or not
indeed.
ignore, to tolerate, I would say.
Indeed. Let me sort of put 3 examples to you and see sort of how, if we can discuss a bit sort of what may be problematic or what is not problematic from the viewpoint sort of free speech, and having sort of a legal framework for what we can do online. So 3 typical measures being taken right now is basically we have mandated takedown rules on platforms. So that's one. We have pretty huge fines for platforms that have been found in violation of these mandatory behavioral regulations that exist for them. And I would assume that when you have large fines, it basically leads to a situation which you were discussing previously, which is that, well, better safe than sorry. We practice sort of more of a shock and awe strategy here in order to sort of to censor and to moderate or to take down a lot, just to be on this sort of on the safe side. We don't know if there is actually any violation of or if there's hate speech, if there's something illegal going on here, but we censor it anyway because we can't take the risk of getting a fine, which is pretty substantial. So we have these type of rules. What do you think? Are they all these type of measures difficult from a viewpoint sort of securing online freedom of speech, or are they? Am I sort of exaggerating the effects that they may have on what platforms are doing?
No, I think it's right. I think you're right. So I don't. I'm not happy with the mandatory takedown. That especially not when they're combined with huge fines. And also, I think it's strange in a sense that we've sort of just come to accept that the remedy for speech that is either illegal or violates terms of service is that it must be deleted. if I say something that runs contrary to a law, it does not, we don't normally go around burning newspapers or books anymore. We used to do that in previous times, but we don't anymore. So I think for me the best solution is not necessarily one of law. It's more one of architecture or decentralization. I think you and I are old enough to both probably have had a blog at one point and sort of be enthusiastic about the blogosphere. And no one really cared about content moderation or anything at the time because, a blog, if it was really successful, had hundreds of thousands of readers, maybe some had millions, but no one had 2.7 billion users, and they didn't distribute content in the same way that these huge platforms do. So if you had 250,000 neo-Nazis congregating on one blog, that was not necessarily a huge problem. Most of us would not get to engage it. And so the ecosystem was so decentralized that we could still believe in the initial promise of free and equal speech that the internet promised. That's no longer the case. So my hope is that we can get back to some of that. That might take innovation. It might be competition law. I don't have I'm just a lawyer, so I don't have the perfect answer. But I think a compromise now would be to say, okay, international human rights law actually has some standards, and they're pretty stringent when it comes to hate speech, like said, in the sense that they're quite speech protective, much more so than what follows under German law, what follows under the European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence. So limit this to the sort of the worst aspects that where there's incitement to some harmful conduct, and then you and I might be deeply offended about specific content that goes against some value that we care about, but then let the users have more influence over what type of content they want to be confronted with. So rather than have that determined centrally by platforms or governments. So the centralized content moderation would be limited to sort of the worst of the worst, but you and I could then filter our own news feeds and comments. Of course, the downside of this could be that the dreaded filter bubble effect might that might actually be a thing, but I think that would be preferable rather than having sort of a one-size-fits-all, where it almost certainly becomes the lowest common denominator if we are to please everyone. So I think that to me, first the best solution would be a more decentralized social media environment. The next best solution would be one where you try to use international human rights law, the ECIPE, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as the benchmark for the worst of the worst, and then leave users to be their own sort of first line of defense against offensive content, rather than put it in the hands of American tech companies or governments.
Yep. The third example, as you just mentioned it, that I was going to bring up is also which comes in the Digital Services Act now, which is a requirement to have systemic monitoring of content on platforms. And here my fear would be sort of that systemic monitoring might sound innocent when we talk about it like that, but sort of when you feed it into the type of moral moderation practices and algorithms that we've seen developed over the past 2 years, this may actually lead to a lot more moderation and takedown of material that simply isn't in violation of anything. It isn't even objectionable. It just may just be sort of that one individual have said something in the past that may be objectionable, and therefore is going to be censored for the future. Now, I want to ask you another question, which is also looking at now sort of taking more from the Digital Services Act, but also looking perhaps at a broader discussion here at more perhaps constructive policies and proposals. There is an attempt in Europe to have some sort of out-of-court settlement between users that have seen their content being moderated, or perhaps they have had their accounts cancelled overall. What would be sort of a good policy here from sort of a freedom of speech perspective? Is the Facebook model with an oversight board, do you think that is a good model? Should we work with having access to more formal institutions for settling disputes, settling perhaps even more fundamental problems that may have arisen as a consequence of moderation activities? Is there sort of a good way to think about this in a freedom of speech context where at least we allow some degree of appeal?
Yeah, no, I think really it's good that we see some experimenting, really, because I don't think anyone has a perfect answer. You know, there's been a lot of skepticism about the oversight board. I tend to think, you know, having read quite a few of its decisions, and also having sort of commented on them, or in the consultation process, I think they tend to be quite speech protective, and they have, I think, struck down the vast majority of the decisions where Facebook has removed or blocked content. So I think that might be promising, but you know, again, it's not a court, so its policies, its decisions are not necessarily relevant for everyone else. The problem with sort of having, you know, it sounds really promising to have users have a right to challenge if stuff is removed. The problem is, you know, we did a study, you mentioned it, called Rushing to Judgment, and we showed that in the European countries that we looked at, using very sparse data, so it was more indicative than an authoritative study, but I think the average was that hate speech cases in a number like 5 or 6 European countries, it was something like 700 days that the authorities used to determine whether someone who had said something should be convicted or not for hate speech. And so if you have 2.7 billion users, and everyone has to have a right to challenge in a meaningful sense the content moderation policies, then that will be time consuming. Of course, I mean, it would have to be automated in a way, so that it would require, you know, the engineers to really be able to develop some pretty robust algorithms that could take into account context and so on. If that's possible, well, you know, why not? Let's try it. But again, you know, if we move towards a more decentralized model, then that would not necessarily be necessary. Because you had smaller, more decentralized platforms rather than these huge ones.
Yeah. Let us talk a little bit more about the future and the development of civil liberties online and what governments are doing. Now, if I'm simplifying things quite a lot, I think we can say that there are 2 more fundamental views out there. One saying that big social media companies are private entities and should be allowed to set their own standards for what they allow on their platforms. The other view is that these big platforms are now part of what we can call the public square, and therefore they should be regulated in a way that conforms to rules that perhaps would apply for protection for freedom of speech more generally in a society. We have, for instance, I've seen this in America, that there is a sort of a call for First Amendment principle to apply on platforms as well. We've touched upon this issue already, Jacob, but sort of can you just sort of flesh out your view here? What would be your take on this discussion? Are these platforms, especially the big ones, are they entirely private, or are they also part of the public square and should have some freedom of speech regulations imposed upon them?
Well, they certainly are part of the public sphere, and you know, this is where debate and the sharing of information is happening. It's also where traditional media have become reliant on sharing a lot of their information. But it doesn't necessarily mean that if you imposed free speech protections on them, that you know it would strengthen free speech. I think almost inevitably it would. You know, if governments were to regulate this, then I think it would almost inevitably lead to less rather than more free speech. And you know, look at the British Online Harms Bill, where I think the idea is that you have to have a regulator, and then there's a duty of care to both remove illegal but also certain types of harmful content, whatever harmful means. But also, I think it's just, you know, and I might be contradicting myself here a bit, because I've argued that international human rights standards should be used by platforms, but I think it would be difficult to require them legally to do so. I think in many ways these platforms are just too different from states to be able to apply it in a rigorous manner. And I, you know, certainly when I see all the different attempts by Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. To change the CDA 230 over there, it seems clear to me that governments, you know, at the current development stage of social media and internet would really limit free speech online if they were to regulate it. But you know, we might get developments. I think in Germany you have a number of court cases where courts are actually determining whether it violated the Constitution or not, that Facebook removed stuff. And I think some of those decisions might go to the Constitutional Court. I'm not an expert in any ways in German constitutional law, but that's my understanding. And so it'll be interesting to see where that ends up. But I would say, you know, I don't think we would have had as you know, the whole the success which social media platforms have had in basing themselves on user-generated content, which basically allows you and me to share information, if it hadn't been sort of the more American model, where they are in general not liable for user-generated content with some exceptions, but also are generally free to adopt their own content moderation policies. But again, this whole ecosystem, this sort of virtuous circle also depends on this underlying culture of free speech, and that being respected by both governments and users. And that becomes extremely difficult when platforms are global and have to manage the expectations and very, very different views on the limits of free speech of governments and users around the world.
All right, thank you very much, Jacob. I have, during our conversation, weaved in some questions from people that are joining us on different platforms. We have one person who wants to ask a question, make a comment himself, and I am now going to invite Jaimeen Patel. You're with us now.
Thank you, Frederick. Thank you, first of all, Jacob, for a fascinating and nuanced take on this debate, which is obviously full of very many very interesting little wormholes we could go down. My question was in two parts, really. I think the difference I see is now not so much about freedom of speech and how that's evolved, but freedom of reach, to use the lazy cliches that we see, and the freedom of reach that's based in part on certain platforms' business models, which lies in creating content that incites a visceral reaction from users. And that seems to be linked to the most problematic content that we've seen on some of the social media, especially around January the 6th, but also on other controversial issues. So is perhaps the answer to look at how platforms promote different pieces of content, so that it's not freedom of speech that's affected, but actually the freedom to say what you like, but not the freedom to have it transmitted to as many people as possible for economic interests of the platform. And then secondly, about the issue of scale, I think you make some very interesting points about having a decentralized set of social networks, making the problem easier to handle. I think that's really the problem that everyone has seen, that the scale of the internet means that it's no longer feasible to manage freedom of speech through human means as we have done in the past. And so I think that the choice really is either to use more automation, as we've done with things like speed cameras in the past with other problems, or to bring the problem down to a more human-sized, regulable level. Which one of those options do you think would work best? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to so-called freedom of reach, I don't think you can get around. It would still, to use an American term, you would still, I think, need to discriminate based on viewpoints, because someone would have to say which are the problematic viewpoints that are being given undue amplification. And, use the US, ask a Republican and a Democrat whether those who are being unreasonable, is it the MAGA crowd or is it the Black Lives Matter crowd? And you're going to get very different. Answers. So I don't think that solves it. And I also think the underlying problem, if you like, is more to do with human psychology. A British tabloid with a saucy headline is going to sell more copies than the Times Literary Review. That's just human nature, that we are turned on by sensationalist news that grabs our brains. And I don't think that is something that we cannot regulate our way out of entirely, at least. And for your latter question, it's not necessarily, it's not perhaps either or. I think I'm certainly no engineer or a software developer, so I don't know much about how you create algorithms and sort of the potential of machine learning. But I would imagine that it's possible for it to be to improve, so that at least some of the things that cannot be done currently, it might be possible, at least for some categories of speech, to have a less problematic automation than currently. But again, as I said, decentralization will probably have its own problems, but I think it's healthier in the long run than the centralized model. And if that is true, then it should also be more manageable to have humans in more control than currently, where 99% of hate speech is identified proactively by automation looking at Facebook. So, yeah, it's some of these discussions are really frustrating in the sense that, and I think an analogy is going back to the invention of the printing press, and for how long, how many centuries did it take before before free speech was actually accepted as a principle, and also that the disruptions from sort of the marriage of the Reformation and the printing press sort of subsided in Europe. So I think in many ways we're sort of we're feeling our way forward, because this is in the digital era, this is uncharted territory, and no one has a perfect solution, because we haven't really experienced this before. There are, of course, some experiences that we can draw on, but it's not like we have perfect solutions, and that's why we also have to experiment. And I think experimentation will also be easier with decentralization, rather than having sort of a couple of huge platforms.
All right, Jacob, thank you so much for taking the time to share your views, analysis with us. It's been very informative, very enlightening. I enjoyed this conversation very much.
Me too. It was an absolute pleasure. So thank you very much, and everyone who took the time to watch. And if anyone has questions or comments, feel free to reach out.
Thank you indeed, and also to thank you to all of you that have watched us on different platforms. This conversation will be available also as a video and a podcast coming out very soon. So if you like to share it with others, you can easily do so via our website. So thank you all, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.